And we're live, I believe. Are we live, Doug? We're live. Okay. Hello, good evening, relatives. Thank you for joining us. We're going to go ahead and dive right in. We have a lot to cover and we have exactly an hour. Thank you all for tuning in this evening. I want us all to recognize that wherever you may be tuning in on Turtle Island, that you are on native land. We predate so-called America. A little housekeeping before we get started. This session is being recorded. There is a link that will be shared on the Grand Canyon Trust website, and we also have a YouTube channel. I've been getting a lot of emails from folks who want to access the recordings. You may access it at the Grand Canyon Trust YouTube channel and also at our website. Thank you so much. This session is also being streamed Facebook Live. For those of you watching on Facebook, we will try to check the questions and comments, and apologies if we miss anything. All attendees are on mute and your videos are not on display. Please submit any questions through the Q&A function, and we will save those questions and follow up with our panelists. And again, thank you all for tuning in this evening. I'll go ahead and introduce myself, and I will go ahead and introduce our panelists as well. Talia Boyd and Shea, Torich Eatney and Shle, Toa Higlini Bashis Chain, Ashcha Edesha Chedo, Toba Hadeshanele, Hat out in Shle. I am based in Gallup, New Mexico. I was born and raised on the Great Diné Nation. I am a mother and a community organizer, and I'm also the current cultural landscapes manager for the Grand Canyon Trust. And this evening, I would like to welcome Jonathan Perry. He is from the Crown Point area in northwestern New Mexico on the Navajo Nation. He is an active member of the Eastern Navajo Diné Against Uranium Mining, also called NDOM. And he is a former member of the Navajo Nation Council and a chapter official. He is a proponent of the Diné fundamental law. He incorporates it into the work he does in environmental justice work. Thank you for joining us tonight, Mr. Perry. Next, I would like to welcome Jessica Stago. Jessica is the program manager of the Native America Business Incubator, NABIN, formerly NABIN, and now serves as the director of the Business Incubator for Change Labs, which supports the growth of Native-owned businesses. Jessica hopes to use her bachelor's degree from the Arizona State University and MBA from the University of Phoenix to build an ecosystem of entrepreneurship in Native communities. She grew up traveling between Sitso, Arizona, her home community on the Navajo Reservation, and a small town of Winslow, Arizona, where she still lives today. Her teenage son, Josiah, plays sports year-round, so when she is not working, she spends time at home watching football, basketball, and baseball. Thank you for joining us, Jessica. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Curley, Andrew Curley. He's an assistant professor of the School of Geography, Development, and Environment at the University of Arizona. His research focuses on the everyday incorporation of indigenous nations into colonial economies. Building on ethnographic research, his publications speak on how indigenous communities understand coal, energy, land, water, infrastructure, and development in an era of energy transition and climate change. He holds a doctorate degree in development sociology from Cornell University, studying sovereignty, livelihood, and challenging coal in the Navajo Nation. He is a member of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. Thank you for joining us, Andrew.
Thank you.
And just to give a little bit of context and background for our discussion this evening, I'd like to state the historical discrimination against Native peoples has heavily influenced our socioeconomic position. Native peoples in disproportionate numbers face economic instability and extreme high levels of poverty. Many natives living on reservations are confined to a cycle of poverty, and this is influenced by geographic location. Our communities are often lack basic infrastructure like grocery stores and water infrastructures, leading us to other communities such as border towns for services. Money flows outward and the local economy is further weakened in a positive feedback loop that perpetuates poverty in our communities. The cost of uranium mine cleanup is high, and you cannot put a price on all the relatives that we have lost and the permanent contamination of our homelands. Many mining companies from the time of uranium mining proliferation have either shut down or run out of money. With many of these companies unable to pay their due share in uranium cleanup efforts, taxpayers are now flipping the bill for cleanup. With that, we'd like to jump into our panelist questions. And again, I will go ahead and ask Andrew to kick us off. And here is our first question. How has uranium and the nuclear fuel chain impacted tribal communities economically? And what is a boom and bust economy?
Did you ask me to go first? Sorry.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Andrew Curley Nishiye Bilagana Nishle, Hanagani Bashachin Bilagana Dashache, Kia Ani Dashanale. That's an excellent question. And the boom and bust economy are a kind of an economic experience. It speaks to an experience that we've been dealing with in the Navajo Nation for quite some time, going back into the 1930s when the Navajo Nation government was created as a way to facilitate certain kinds of mineral extraction within the southwest of Colorado Plateau area. I'm going to share some information that I compiled on the screen in preparation for this presentation. So the boom is this sudden activity of economic development, of jobs, of revenues coming into leaseholders, lease agreeers like the Navajo Tribal Council, and then the bust is when all of that disappears and collapses. And we've seen cycles of this within the Navajo Nation. And what's interesting about uranium is that uranium kind of foresees what's happening with coal. So tomorrow, actually, the stacks of the Navajo generating station are supposed to collapse as a form of demolition. And we're seeing the collapse of the Navajo coal economy. 20, 30 years before that, we also saw the same thing happen with uranium. So a quick history of the boom. Uranium started as, and this was said in previous discussions here, but the uranium started as this post-war military development. What I think is really interesting about uranium in particular is that the development was sponsored in large part by the Atomic Energy Act, and that set in motion what would become the Department of Energy. And from 1947 to 1962, extending actually into 1965, the dates vary, but around 62 and 65, the federal government was the main buyer of uranium mining, partnering with private corporations, companies, to extract uranium in the reservation and then bring it to the federal government for its nuclear development, and in order to develop its nuclear arsenal as part of its Cold War economy. And what's interesting about this boom is that it's also at the same time, that's when the coal economy is starting to take off. And that's when we start to have the lawyers coming to Navajo Nation Council telling them that they ought to start developing their coal reserves because nuclear power is going to quickly supplant the coal. And so this is the only time you could take advantage of it. So there was these predictions of nuclear being the energy driver for energy systems and energy development throughout the Western states. And I'm almost done, and I'll conclude by saying that all of this was going on until the 1970s, and then around 1970, between 1970 and 1986, that's when uranium within the Navajo Nation was sold commercially, and then that market bottomed out. And eventually, we started to see the cancer rates, we started to see the environmental impacts in the late 70s and early 80s. That leads to where the discussion is today. But that's the bust cycle of the boom and bust. So I'll just pause it there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Jonathan or Jessica, would you like to add anything there?
I'll go ahead and go. I'll just go ahead and introduce myself really quickly. Ate she Jessica Stago Nisha, but Danishle dozilka an bashichin ki ani dashache dozilka an dashanale. And I want to thank Talia for having me today, and I'm really glad to join you on this historic day, and join all of you on this historic day for us. And also, thank you, Andrew, for that overview. And I think what's interesting there is the timeline. It started in the 1930s, and it was sort of the boom reached in the 1970s, 80s, when the Navajo Nation was selling uranium to generally the federal government. And I just think about, I think that one of the biggest impacts of uranium mining on our people is just the legacy that it's left behind. All those years ago it was pitched to our government and to our leaders as a pathway to economic growth for our communities. And instead, it's really just left a legacy of poverty that's really led to negative health outcomes, extreme damage to our lands, and also it also was a complete failure in terms of providing access to the economic and financial tools needed to really build up our economies and our communities in the way that we felt good about, and that was good for us. So I think one of the long-term impacts is that we have a dependence on the economy, right, or on extractive industries that was developed through, as Andrew said, the strategy that was laid out for us by mostly outside attorneys. And so that dependence has now created a dependence that we have on border towns and communities where our people experience racism and discrimination, and yet we're dependent on those towns for our basic needs and services. And so in this way, there's been a power dynamic that's been created in terms of just being able to provide basic services that our people need to live. And I think that this year we've seen that sort of amplified, but we've also seen people on the ground who are doing awesome things, awesome work around food sovereignty and providing water and clean water for many people on the reservation. And so I think that started something that's exciting to see right now.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And we got to talk about how the mining companies especially use a lot of groundwater, right? Here in the Southwest, we don't have those groundwater, we don't have those water infrastructures, even in our tribal communities. And they have exploited our natural resources in so many ways. However, there's, again, a lot of infrastructures that are still not on our reservations. Jonathan, would you like to add anything there?
Sure, thank you. And again, I also would like to thank you for giving me time to speak this evening. I appreciate the invitation. Jonathan Perry and Shadow Twitter Shadow Tohe Gline Bashichin Tenabitni Dashichedo Bit Anita. And I really enjoy the information that's being provided. In addition to that, with the Navajo communities, with the communities within also, northwestern New Mexico, we see the impacts with the local families during the time that a lot of these projects were being carried out within the region. Navajo Nation was also dealing with other federal legislations and acts going forward, the Howard Wheeler Act and a few others to name, but that really changed the way families were providing for themselves and their relatives. And with the uranium coming in, uranium development coming in, you see a lot of providers going out, a lot of the men in the family going out and taking jobs out there. This impacted a lot of the families in the long run because a lot of times their sole provider that was heading out to work was becoming ill. And if you go to a lot of the communities, you hear a lot of folks talk about when they were young, well, the older generation, when they were younger, they asked why there weren't too many men, in the local communities. What happened to them? Where are all the elders? And the fact was that they were exposed as younger adults, and a lot of them became ill, and many of them did not live to become elderly or seniors. And so the next upcoming generations that came in, they had questions, of why they were missing family members, but there were a lot of ways that the economy and how the uranium industry impacted local communities and families. Um, the traditional Navajo economy as it was before was completely different, but as the Western society continued to spread across the Navajo Nation, you start to see how families were trying to adapt and changing their methods of providing for themselves. But here within northwestern New Mexico, there's a great area that you can see where the boom and bust economy really hurt a lot of the locals, and that's in Grants, New Mexico. You see how the community there was so reliant on the nuclear industry. They put everything on it, hoping that it was going to save the economy and really provide jobs and everything for the families there in the long run. But when the industry itself pulled out, a lot of the people within the region felt, economically hit by those decisions. And you see how, in the long run, how they're trying to recover from that reliance on one sole source for uh, providing for the community. On Navajo Nation, you're also seeing that as well, but it's not so much with uranium, but you see other fossil fuels that were dependent, and you're seeing this transition happening. And the boom and bust economy really is not beneficial to anyone. And I really enjoyed Dr. Curley's explanation on how he provided information, but I just wanted to provide those additional comments.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Yes, you all gave some great insight there. There's a lot of questions rolling in. We'll try to get to those towards the end of the session here. Let's go ahead and move on to our next question. This is a kind of a bigger question. And let's go ahead and keep our little rotation that we got going. So Andrew, let's go ahead and have you kick this off. What is the cost for cleanup? What are the federal government's economic responsibilities to tribes when it comes to cleanup and cumulative studies? And who pays for the cleanup and studies? Thank you.
Okay, so for the last part of that question, much of this is being financed by the federal government, and the cleanup, not only the cleanup, but the research and the compensation in the form of RECA, the radiation. My mind is drawing a blank here. We'll get into the acronym in a second, but what I was able to find in researching before this presentation was that starting in 1962, there was a research that that Congress had sponsored looking into this problem of lung cancers and uranium workers dying in this industry, as early as the early 1960s. And in fact, the first death attributed to uranium work was going back into the 1950s. And so you start to have these reports that are generated. So this one that went to the subcommittee, I have the bullet point right here. The subcommittee of labor did a study on 3,200 uranium coal workers, 750 who were indigenous in this area, in the Colorado Plateau area, and 60 had died of lung cancer, which is a significantly high rate compared to other kinds of work, right? And so they're already discovering that these industries have these effects on people's bodies, just not only on the workers, but then on the people that live around the mine sites and who are family members of the workers. And so that's a big part of the story. The federal government's funding these studies, and at the same time they're not really disseminating these results. We don't really start to respond to it until the 1980s. Not until 20 years later, 1986, do we put a moratorium on uranium mining in the Navajo Nation, even though this study started to come out in 1966. At the same time, we're starting to sign coal leases in the reservation. So with that federal oversight in cleanup and in research, you also have a lack of dissemination of information. So that's an important part of the story to think about. I'm going to pause my talk there.
Okay, thank you so much. Jonathan or Jessica, would you like to add there? Again, I'll go ahead and repeat the question. What is the cost for cleanup? What are the federal government's economic responsibilities to tribes when it comes to cleanup or cumulative studies? And who pays for the cleanup and studies?
So from an economic standpoint, Andrew's correct in that the federal government usually finances these studies and, you know, has even created government entities or departments specifically around cleaning up abandoned mines. There's the abandoned mine list, or what is the, we're having trouble with, with the acronyms here. Abandoned Mines Fund or something that's pretty active on the nation, on the Navajo Nation anyways. And, but there seems to be always funding that's there, but does it ever get to a point where things are actually cleaned up, where the land is restored? And I think that what normally happens is it's community members who have to put in their own resources, their own time, to make sure that their communities are healthy, and they do that for the sake of their future generations, right? And I think one of the things that I think is important is that our lands have been damaged, and as Indigenous people, we have knowledge about, because it's in our stories, what the land was before the damage, not only the way it looked or the weather patterns or anything like that, but what we used to live off of and what we built our own economies on. Those resources, the food security that it provided to us before we became dependent on the commercial food system, where the water was, the life-sustaining water that we had before the damage. And so from an economic perspective, I think that, and this is really just my opinion, I think that it's Indigenous people that really need to take responsibility and be the lead in terms of how this cleanup happens, and who they need to hold accountable, and utilize resources that are financial resources to be put into our community specifically for this purpose. Because once that starts to happen, then people begin to really want to protect their work, and protect what is their life-giving, developing the life-giving resources that they have right there within their own lands and within their own communities. And so for me, there is, I think that the federal government will really not be able to completely clean up these sites without giving that power and empowering the communities to do that and to take that on.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Jessica. Jonathan, would you like to add anything there?
Yes, I sure do. Thank you. The whole discussion on cleanup can be complex, because going back to the beginning of a lot of these projects, a lot of the extraction that began, there was not proper assessments done, not proper documentation done on these areas. So when we talk about cleanup, we're trying to measure to pre-mining conditions. And a lot of these reports that come out, from the federal government and others that are working on these different 5 to 10 year plans that keep coming out every few years, you don't see an overall total, because really nuclear development, the entire nuclear fuel chain provides so much, or it's really damaging in all stages. And uranium mining, the front of the cycle, or the front of the chain, I'm sorry, really it's hard to measure, because talking about Navajo communities, you don't see a lot of the proper documentation that happened in the past, and you see it with the workers, and then this is probably going to go into the RICA discussion, but the entire, I guess, negligence that occurred, we're still feeling it today, and there's really no comprehensive approach to how we're going to address cleanup until the federal agencies and even the corporations, the companies that are behind a lot of these projects take responsibility. It's going to be the taxpayers' dollar, and the public is going to be paying for this, and those that are truly responsible continuously get off the hook because there's different reasons, but you don't see the responsible parties stepping forward. And if we are very lucky or fortunate to find a few corporations out there that are still in existence, we're barely scraping a few dollars out of them comparative to the destruction, not only to the environment but the destruction to families and the communities at the local level. So the total cost of cleanup is really, we can't measure it because it's so much at this point. And when we talk about these sites, you have plumes and you have other natural movements happening, and it's expanding. And we always say that contamination does not know any jurisdiction. It's going to continue to grow, and it's going to continue to plague the regions. Not only on Navajo, but you have Laguna, Acoma. You have other locations across the country, indigenous communities that are trying to get this addressed, but until the federal government itself steps up and coordinates with the agencies as well as the corporations that were behind a lot of these projects, we're going to continue to see the taxpayers' dollars being used. But then again, you have a lot of corporations or companies that are no longer in existence now, and what do we do then with those sites that have been abandoned? So I just wanted to add those few comments.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for adding that. Yes, you all brought up some really great points. A lot of times too, these studies, the mining companies pay for those studies, right? And so a lot of times we have to demand for independent studies outside of those studies that are paid for by those industries, by the uranium industries. And so, the cost is tremendous. It's huge. It's billions and billions of dollars to clean up this radioactive waste. And again, there's nowhere to put this waste anywhere in the world. This is a problem worldwide. Nobody wants this waste, and nobody deserves radioactive waste. Again, the half-life of uranium is 4.5 billion years. So these are really big issues that are going to be impacting all of the next 7 generations. And so it's important to continue these dialogues. Thank you all for adding to that. Let's go ahead and move on to our next question. And this is something that we all kind of touched on already, is what is the Radiation Exposure and Compensation Act, and why is it important? And Andrew, let's go ahead and have you kick it off again. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll be quick with this one. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act was passed in 1990, and it was designed to compensate former uranium mine workers or people who worked in the industry from a period of time. I believe the years were 1946 to 1971. And this is really to compensate the workers who were involved in the boom cycle, like we were talking about the boom in the beginning, the boom cycle, when the federal government was purchasing, when storing and bringing that uranium for its own Cold War economy. So the federal government realized it was the main purchaser there. It was creating incentives for this kind of development. It was agreeing to like a minimum price for uranium and giving all sorts of loopholes for these companies, these fly-by-night companies to come in and open up uranium mines throughout the reservation and around the reservation, not just within reservation lands. And as Honorable Perry just said a moment ago, this is something that, in the lands, reservation boundaries aren't very meaningful because water goes between all of these communities. And if you contaminate a water source, aquifer water source, or an underground water source, even if it's outside of the formal reservation boundaries, it can still impact indigenous communities. And so anyway, getting back to the point, RICA RICA is a federal law designed to compensate these workers, but it's about to expire. The fund is about to expire, and it really doesn't address all of the cumulative costs that we just mentioned from the previous question.
Thank you, Andrew. Jessica or Jonathan, would you like to add anything to the RICA question?
I don't have very much to add, other than I just want to reiterate the point that Honorable Perry mentioned about the damage that's done is there's no way to compensate for that. And I think that that's probably the main point, is that the government likes to, put in place certain laws that to incentivize people or governments to go along with the plan. But I think that as we can all see now, that uranium and the mining of uranium and the mining industry in general, there's a reason why there's a boom and bust in that industry, and that's pretty much by design. They, these, as Andrew mentioned, fly-by-night companies will come in and extract the resources and participate in the boom and do things like RICA in order for people to go along with it. But in the end, we see that the real economic benefit and the power that comes with that is remains with these companies. And then once the bus comes, then they're no longer around to deal with the cleanup. And so the negative impacts of these industries always seems to end up, both economically and socially, the negative impacts always ends up within people of color and communities and rural communities.
Yes, thank you for adding.
Can I add one thing I forgot to mention?
Sure, go ahead, Andrew.
There's also certain kinds of social changes that these laws have. And so one like little known story about RICA is that early on, when former uranium mine workers were trying to apply to get compensated, or the widows, the spouses of these of deceased uranium workers who were applying for compensation, they were denied because they didn't have proper marriage certificates according to Western ideas of marriage. And that's initially why we put a Navajo Marriage Act in our Navajo Nation Code, was to recognize traditional marriages, because that was the kind of marriage many of these couples had, the wife and the husband, the husband who might have been dead. So that way that widow could get money from the compensation. But what happens is then we make our marriage laws very strict, and then that eventually became the Name Marriage Protection Act in 2005, which was discriminatory against LGBTQ communities because of saying, oh, we can only recognize heterosexual marriages. And so that whole thread actually started from uranium, as it turns out. So I mean, it has these kind of secondary effects over time.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. Jonathan, would you like to add anything there on RICA?
Sure. A few comments. In addition to the workers, the downwinders with the testing sites, these locations where nuclear testing were done. But the RICA itself is a minor step in a direction that the federal government needs to take. It's a minor step in ways that RICA itself needs to be further modified to extend coverage. And there are communities out there and groups of people who are working on amendments being proposed to Congress, and this is to expand to downwinders. In addition to that, the post-71 workers, there are many who are not eligible and are being denied compensation. And as Dr. Curley stated, that the deadline or the end of this act is coming up, the sunset's coming up. I believe it's 2022. There needs to be additional work done at the congressional level to expand and to extend what RICA has started. And, you know, in looking at RICA itself too, it gives us a little bit of light in terms of showing that the federal government does know that they did, you know, there was negligence on their part. And, you know, going back to the, you know, 90 years ago, 80 years ago, when the nuclear movement started, the nuclear industry. And so, you know, there is definitely more work that needs to be done on RICA, and there definitely needs to be an expansion on the timeline or time frame that's being, uh, um, you know, that's in place right now. So it needs to go beyond 2022, and we definitely need to look beyond what's currently in the language. We got to look at the downwinders, the communities that were surrounding these testing sites, the routes that you know, the routes along these areas where the transportation of the nuclear material was done. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done with RICA.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you know, being an organizer and being out in the field and hearing stories from folks, RICA's a big one. You know, we've lost so many people, and there are a lot of widows out there, a lot of survivors who even our elders trying to navigate this system and this process of RICA. It's so confusing and it's so long, and it's, you know, a lot of them just don't complete it because it's hard. It's hard for them. It's hard for our elders. It's hard for anybody who's a survivor of this, of losing a loved one to uranium, to go through that. It's re-traumatizing our communities in so many ways. And it's absolutely heartbreaking. And this is stories that I hear firsthand from elders who are trying to navigate this RICA process and how to get compensation. And it brings me to tears every time. And these are real issues that are still happening, and our elders are dealing with this. And so it really is important for our young people too to learn what RICA is and to help our elders in our communities navigate these processes, because these are foreign ways of thinking for us as Native peoples. These are foreign governments that have been forced upon us, and you know, they're not, our elders are not used to this. So these are another reason why our young people are needed when it comes to these issues, and that we really need to have these conversations with amongst our tribal members internally as well. So thank you all for shedding light on that and providing information. It's absolutely an important topic. So thank you. Let's go ahead and move on to our next question. This one is, what is a just transition, and how are tribal communities implementing it? And I want to go ahead and have Jessica kick us off on this one, if you wouldn't mind. Jessica.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting conversation because the impact, or the sheer sort of sprawl of the impact across our communities and across indigenous communities, from powerful industries like the uranium industry, really set off, you know, again, it's generational impacts that are not only impacted the health of our people, but also just how we live. The secondary social issues that came from our responses to how, you know, to navigating an industry like that in our communities. The Marriage Act that Andrew mentioned, similar to that, there's secondary issues in terms of people being able to support their own family outside of those industries. And so, you know, the entire government and the business laws that are written into our tribal governments really puts in place barriers to economic growth from entrepreneurship and from people investing in their own communities. And so I think we have to start looking at that. when we want to see how do we move forward. And so, but to answer the question, I think, to answer the question, the Just Transition movement is sort of it's a national economic platform for mining communities to transition their economy from one that's based on the extraction of natural resources to what is sometimes called a living or a regenerative economy. And that's an economy that creates value by being dependent on local sources of labor, skills, and sustainable resources. And so our tribal communities are implementing just transition projects in a number of ways. I think many people think of renewable energy projects or utility scale wind and solar power generation projects. And those things are great. But equally important, I think, is the ability for the micro level of our economies to be empowered to make an impact. And these are businesses, these are locally owned businesses, these are entrepreneurs, they're local people who work independently in their communities, such as artists or farmers. They're young people who are starting projects in food security and sustainable housing. And there are families who are seeking to be energy independent, like truly energy independent by generating their own power, the power that they use within their own family or within their own, little community. As families, we normally, on the reservation, that families usually live in small clusters. So people are getting together to figure out how do they create power for their homes and their clusters, and really to be truly energy independent. And so these people who are making investments in their community. That's how you begin to build a living economy, or an economy that is based off of, so where we're interdependent of each other within the community versus being dependent on outside communities. So I'll stop there and for that question.
Thank you, Jessica. That was excellent. Andrew or Jonathan, would you like to add to that?
I'll let Jonathan go first.
Thank you. Yeah, I do have a few comments on that. Well, first off, with the just transition, the initiative to, it's a good initiative to begin with. And I think when we talk about the tribal communities, here on the Navajo Nation, we do have a beginning discussion in terms of looking local. If the Navajo Nation, and if we look at the community-based land use plans and really take that document seriously, if we were to develop further discussions and really emphasize planning at the local level, we can really do a lot for our communities. We began those discussions, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done with that document. The other part in regards to the transition, and this is something that happens at a national level. You see the emphasis on carbon emissions with fossil fuels, and one thing that always is talked about is nuclear energy. Where does that sit? And those of us having to live with the impacts of uranium mining know that nuclear energy is not green energy, not in any way, shape, or form. Unfortunately, we do have many out there who consider nuclear energy green, but there's really a lot to consider in terms of the nuclear fuel chain. When we talk about the front end all the way to the back end, every step of the nuclear fuel chain produces waste. There is a lot of things we got to consider, and in terms of whatever technology is being talked about out there, whether we talk about conventional mining or ISL mining, the in-situ mining, there's a lot of emphasis on saying, oh, that's green, it's environmentally safe, but in reality, these technologies are not safe, and we got to really look at the ideas being presented in a just transition. And so nuclear energy, I guess what I'm saying is that regardless of the fact that the argument is always made that there's little to no carbon emissions. We got to look at the entirety of the nuclear fuel chain and look at where the uranium pellets and rods that are being used in the power plants, where they come from, and the communities that are going to be continuously exposed and having to be in the front lines in terms of trying to defend their water and their homelands. And we really got to be cautious in terms of how we talk about what types of green energy projects are being considered, or what is green energy overall to begin with. So we really got a lot to clarify. And in nuclear energy and the nuclear industry, we often get that misunderstanding, and we really got to further educate. But as stated, we really got to emphasize local and the communities. We do have the human resource. We have a lot of knowledge within our own people. We have a lot of knowledge at the local level. A lot of our young people are becoming very outstanding in different fields. And if we can capitalize on their knowledge and their talents, there's so much we can do at the community level. And we really can come up with different plans and different initiatives to fully transition from these fossil fuels, because Navajo Nation is a prime example. You not only have uranium, but you have the coal, you have fracking, all these different projects that benefit off Navajo. But we're here, and a lot of our people still don't have running water. They still don't have electricity. The roads, the infrastructure is bad. Yet these projects are benefiting non-Navajo, and these are $1 million projects that these companies are taking in. Uranium mining is a prime example as well. And when it busts, the revenues that were made by these companies, the profits that were made, really none of it came back to the local community. So there is opportunity for communities to create a stable economy and live in a healthy environment to provide a safe home for their families and the communities. So it is possible. And with Navajo Nation, we definitely need to expand upon the community-based land use plans and really develop locally and start and grow from there. And I just wanted to provide those comments. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. That was great. Yeah, when we talk about the nuclear fuel chain, we have to talk about every step of the chain. And the front end is very carbon intensive. It's very dirty. It requires a lot of fossil fuels, right? So when we talk about nuclear, we have to educate folks that it is not green and it's not clean. The whole nuclear fuel chain from front to end is very carbon intensive, right? So thank you for highlighting that. Andrew, would you like to add?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think when we talk about just transition, the important word there is just, and referring to justice. And transition is actually an old phenomenon, and it's been happening since the 1960s. And that's what I've been trying to talk about with this boom and bust cycle, is that we're always experiencing an energy transition. First it was hydroelectric, then it was coal, then it was uranium, and then it was now it's hydrofracking. And so there's always like a new energy source being pushed onto tribal lands and being pushed onto tribal communities and governments as a way to develop, and the same promises are repeated again and again. You can look at leases 50 years ago and they'll look exactly the same as they do today. So the terms of those leases need to be changed. We need to focus on the justice, which is the just part of the just transition. And that's referring to long conversations, broader conversations about environmental justice, right? There's a whole dialogue about environmental justice that impact Black communities, Hispanic communities, Dene and other indigenous communities. And then there's, that whole environmental justice question is talking about racial justice, which is talking about, histories of white supremacy, histories of settler colonialism, land dispossession, and these long-standing structures of dispossession and disempowerment that are the basis, that are the structure, the foundation of the United States and all of its sub-governments like Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. And so these are the things that we need to keep in mind as a justice part. because the technologies will always change, and even if they're sustainable, even if they're like renewable, they can also be exploitative in the same way that non-renewable technologies are. So that's something that I think is an emphasis, something that we should highlight when we're thinking about these things.
Yes, absolutely. That was great. Thank you so much for highlighting that. That was important. Let's go ahead and move on to our next question. We have about 10 minutes left. And if we have a little bit of time left, we'll go ahead and take a couple of questions. Here is our final question, and that is, what does environmental justice look like for you personally?
You want me to go?
Sure.
So for me, I think that it really has to do with that power that I think we've all talked about in terms of our ability as Indigenous communities to decide for ourselves how we build our community, how we create economic opportunities for our families now, but also future generations. And so pushing the power that's now not within the communities down into our communities so that they have the resources they need, the knowledge that they need, the research that we talked about earlier, the decision about how to, perform reclamation projects or cleaning up abandoned mines, or supporting entrepreneurs, or supporting artists, supporting farmers. All of those decisions that are made about an economy really need to be made within the community. And I think that it's a great point that Andrew mentioned about how even some just transition strategies can also be exploitive of Indigenous communities if they're not approached in the right way. And so I think with that in mind, for me, environmental justice looks like having access to financial resources that uplifts the work that the people are doing, the hard work of ecological restoration, developing products in a sustainable way, and the ability to access appropriate markets for those products, whether it be within the community or outside of the community. And so that for me is what environmental justice would look like, is just empowering the people that are doing the work now.
Heck yes. Thank you so much, Jessica. Andrew, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I think that environmental justice is similar to the response I was giving about just transition, and that these things are related ideas, related concepts, and environmental justice, just for a quick just summary, is this idea that certain communities are disproportionately impacted by environmental dangers, contaminants, production of energy, waste disposal. All sorts of environmental risks are disproportionately put on poor people, put on communities of color. And so that's what we see, when we're thinking about the Navajo Nation. We're surrounded by power plants. We're inundated with abandoned mines. And then we also have all of these other kinds of new pressures for extractive industries in and around our land. And so these things are disproportionately impacting us when we're thinking about the cost, the social costs of environmental damage that's wrought from modern energy systems, and also the societal costs of climate change. Who's bearing all of those costs, and whose lands are dealing with desertification, drought, and lack of water infrastructure. So those are the things that I think we see collectively, like all of us in a community, like we're all community members here when we're thinking about problems of environmental justice.
Thank you, Andrew. Jonathan, would you like to add or provide a response?
Yes, thank you. I think environmental justice is really unique to Indigenous people. Our approach to this entire issue is very unique, going from different people, the different nations that are across the land. We have our own way of approaching this issue. For me, I really acknowledge the Net Fundamental Law, the Net Ani, which identifies and helps us to be who, it helps us to identify our place on the earth, in the universe. It helps us to be responsible individuals. It helps us to respect all life forms, protect our homelands, these sacred elements. It ties our Mother Earth to songs, to stories, to ceremonies, and it really gives us a place as home in this natural world. And so for me, for me, they work in environmental justice. It's a whole nother level. It connects uh, in a way that it's so unique. And I think a lot of us who are indigenous can feel that connection, and we take that role very seriously in the work that we're doing and the studies that we do, the efforts and the initiatives that we participate in. I think that's really makes it really unique for us. But for me personally, it's a way of life. It's grounded in my culture. It's been in my life since I was a child, being incorporated in teachings from my grandparents, and to this day. And that's why for me, it's very important that the incorporation of the net fundamental law is very crucial in when we have these discussions and work done within the environmental justice. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for highlighting that. Yeah, for Indigenous peoples, we've always been about the EJ and conservationist, right? Like we are the original stewards of this land, and so we recognize our deep-rooted relationships with the natural world, and that still stands today, and it's still honored today in many ways through our languages and ceremonies and our life ways. And so it's never been teased apart. And so Native peoples are still very much connected to our land. And in many ways, we are the land. And so what happens to the land happens to us. And so this is why we are so dedicated and passionate about protecting our land, our air, and our water. Again, this is Native land, and we predate America. We have ancestors who are buried in this land, and there's a lot of memory that the land holds. And so it's our responsibility as Native peoples to give back and provide for our Mother Earth. So thank you all panelists for providing such great insight and information for our audiences. And we do have about 3 minutes left, so I want to go ahead and maybe take one question, and then we will start for a wrap. Let's go ahead and take the question from the Q&A. This is from Patricia Cordona. What was the economy in the area where the uranium mines existed? And then also she asked, what was the impact on the wildlife in the area, the water, the land, and from the time it started and ended, and what were the health impacts? So yeah, a lot of these were covered in our previous teach-in series, but any of our panelists are welcome to answer that if you would like. So, anyone?
It's just such a big topic, so it's hard to do it within the time we have. That's my only hesitation.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of those big ones. We can jump. Let's jump to another one. So there was another one in the chat that asked, what was the economic thing in Grants, New Mexico? And so at one point, Grants, New Mexico was the uranium capital of the world, right? And prior to uranium mining, I believe they had a pretty big, it was either a carrot or tomato farm in Grants, New Mexico. And so this was kind of what stimulated a lot of the economy. There was a lot of farmers in the area. But then again, once the Homestake mine and all of these mines started coming in around Mount Taylor, it started to contaminate the groundwater. And so a lot of folks in Grants and also in the village of Milan have experienced a lot of groundwater contamination. And for those reasons, a lot of those folks don't farm anymore, and they can't farm anymore because of the water has been compromised. And so that's what I know as far as grants and what their local economy looked like before uranium mining came into the picture. And I think that's what Jessica highlighted earlier too, is the fact that a lot of our indigenous communities, we had our own local economies before the extractive industries came in, right? And so this conversation is really highlighting how we need to go back to those ways. Go ahead, Andrew.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, there's some resources that I would like to say, where if you have to answer some of these questions that people had that are longer in length, and one of them is papers that well, I wrote, and then my colleague Moroni Benali wrote about uranium mining back like in 2007, 2006. And this is Uranium Mining and Navajo Thinking is the title of it. And it's a really interesting philosophy of like how we think about the contamination of uranium mining. It's on the Dene Policy Institute website. And then you can also look at the Dene Natural Resource Protection Act. If you just Google that, you can find where we start to use fundamental law, which is like the traditional law, the pre-colonial law that Dene people abide by. And that's what is used as a way to ban uranium mining. Formally, that was passed, I believe, in 2005. And so that was a big innovation of the Navajo Nation to actually ban all uranium mining within reservation land. And so that if you look at that law, you'll find our way of thinking about these issues and how we say it's a bad thing. So I think those are good resources people can look at.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. Check those out, folks. Those are really great resources. And we are at the top of the hour. Hey, that's a really great book. Folks, buy that book. It's a great book. Thank you for highlighting that, Andrew. And I do want to share a couple of quotes before we wrap up, and really want to express again my deep gratitude for all of the panelists that have joined us throughout this teach-in series. It has been huge and tremendous. A lot of amazing people who have been doing the work on the ground for so long. There are so many more people out there who I would love to bring to the table, who have so much more knowledge and information to share with us. There's a lot of really great people in Indian country doing really great, amazing things. And I want to celebrate all of us and highlight all the great work. So thank you all for coming to the table and sharing what you know. It is absolutely needed. And I commend you all for your deep dedication to justice and to our communities and to our lifeways as Indigenous peoples. So thank you. And I want to go ahead and end with a couple of quotes. We Indians are the original environmentalists. We need to get back to that. That is Eloise Cobell. And I got one more. When we're together to protect sacred water, let's do it with dignity. Let's do it with training. Let's do it with unity. And that is Deborah White Plume, a great Lakota warrior who we recently lost. We lost both of those warriors to cancer, and they were both tremendous warriors in fighting for justice and for our tribal communities. So I want to acknowledge those beautiful women and those beautiful matriarchs, and end with those quotes this evening. So again, thank you all for tuning in and making this a successful teach-in series. I hope this is just the beginning of many more. Again, there's a lot of people out there who I didn't have a chance to bring to the table, but I hope to do that in the future. So I recognize everybody who's put in the time to do this work in the past, now, and in the future. So thank you all from the bottom of my heart. And with that, we will go ahead and call that a wrap, folks. Happy holidays. Everybody be safe, take care, stay safe, and we'll see you on the flip-flop in the new year. So thank you all so much. Thank you, panelists. Have a good night, everybody. And again, you can catch this series on the Grand Canyon Trust YouTube channel and also on our website. So feel free to check out all the recordings for the series there. Have a great evening, everybody, and I will see you later. Hagoanet.